Welcome to Retailistic, the official podcast of Coresight Research for March 3rd, 2026. This week, our CEO, Deborah Weinswig, speaks with renowned international trade lawyer Laura Rabinowitz about the recent Supreme Court ruling on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, what their ruling means for tariff policy, and some potential class action risk for companies who petition the government for tariff refunds. But before we dive into this vital conversation, Isla joins us from the London office for a quick preview of some of the research our members will see this week on Coresight.com.
This week, we're taking a closer look at the rapid rise of online grocery in the US, exploring what's driving the surge, who's shopping online, and why the momentum looks set to continue. We'll also go deeper into retail real estate trends with our monthly Store Tracker Extra report. In China, our latest consumer survey insights reveal how shopper sentiment is evolving. We'll also continue our early holiday 2026 coverage, focusing on the retail technologies to start planning for now. Fresh data, practical insights, and forward-looking analysis, all coming this week.
Thanks, Isla. Now here's Deborah and Laura.
We are very excited today to have my dear friend Laura Rabinowitz join us on Retailistic. So, Laura, thank you so much. There's been so much news in supply chain really for the past year, but a certain large announcement last week. And maybe you can kind of like boil down for us the essence of it, and then we can go from there.
Sure. So, yes, I mean, we were waiting for that Supreme Court decision. We didn't know when it was going to come. Oral argument was in November. The Supreme Court has until June to announce their decisions for the term. And then we had Friday morning at 10 a.m. You'd have to be living under a rock not to know about SCOTUS's opinion, affirming the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, affirming the Court of International Trade that the use of the IEEPA statute was inappropriate by the president, exceeded his authority, the administration's authority under the executive to add tariffs pursuant to IEEPA. So now the ruling, which I thought was brilliantly done by the Chief Justice Roberts, and he worked very hard, we know, to get that coalition of 6 justices to support his opinion.
I think that it was interesting. We had a firestorm, if you will, of media inbounding, and my original take was rebates to the retailers could be meaningful. It could be longer. It always is longer than we think it will be. And then, Laura, just as we were preparing for this, you mentioned something that I think many of us haven't thought about, which is it's great, right? I'm looking at it from a retail and tech perspective. So, right, the retailers will be rebated, refunded, et cetera. But you mentioned a few other things that we haven't thought about. Can you maybe elaborate?
Sure. So we can first talk about the refunds. So first of all, the Supreme Court opinion was silent on the issue of refunds. But the case is now going back to the Court of International Trade for the court to order a refund process, and they'll work in conjunction with U.S. Customs, and they'll order U.S. Customs to do that process. So the opinion was silent on whether there were refunds and what the refund process is. I was a little concerned before the opinion came out whether there would in fact be refunds. I didn't really understand how that could happen, but it was a possibility, but I don't think it's a possibility now. I think there will be refunds. The administration has been very clear. They'll issue refunds with interest, although that's not terribly gallant of them because it's statutory and any customs refund comes with interest. There will be a refund process. Now, I'm reminded of the last time there was a similar case, which was over a harbor maintenance fee in the late 1990s, where it was the same, where there was a statute. Plaintiff said it could not collect a duty based on that statute. It was over harbor maintenance fees. It went to the Court of International Trade, Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, up to the Supreme Court, invalidated, very same procedural stance as here, went back to the Court of International Trade to issue a refund process. And at that time, it took the court 5 or 6 months to issue that refund process, which entailed at that time having to file an action in the Court of International Trade and an administrative procedure with Customs. 2 things. First, I don't think it's going to take 5 or 6 months for the court to announce a refund process. First, because there's tremendous public attention here, to say the least. There are bills pending in Congress already for an expedited refund process. The plaintiffs in the Court of International Trade Action they've already filed. The plaintiffs that went up to the Supreme Court have already filed actions in the Court of International Trade for an expedited refund process. There's so much public attention. The governor of New York yesterday said there should be an expedited refund process. So I don't think it will take 5 or 6 months. And the other difference is now everything with customs is very electronic. All import data is in customs database. So technically, customs could issue retroactive refunds instantaneously without an importer having to do anything. They have all the data in their system. Do I think that's likely to happen? Probably not, but it definitely is a chance. They did that fairly recently. I'll just tell you, if you're familiar with the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, which benefits underdeveloped countries or developing countries, and it's country specific and product specific, and it lapsed with Congress for a few years, and then it was reauthorized, and then Customs says we'll issue refunds. I mean, it was pursuant to the bill. We'll issue refunds for the past year, and importers didn't have to do anything because there was an indicator on their entries. Well, that's the same here. When you were importing under IEPA, there's a specific code, so they could do this. I think the chances are unlikely, but it definitely is a possibility.
So if you had to place your bets on the amount of time this will take, what do you think that looks like?
I don't think it will take months for them to issue the refund process, for the court and customs to come out with the refund process. I think the question that I don't know is whether companies will have to file in the Court of International Trade or just file some administrative procedure with customs.
So
whether it's a protest mechanism or not. It might be a protest.
That could be. So if they're then getting a refund, then what's happening from a consumer-facing perspective?
So we fully expect the plaintiffs' bar to be very aggressive and to go after retailers who are getting refunds. And there are even bills in Congress saying that customers should be getting the refunds. So there are some companies that made statements at the time, starting, when the tariffs went up, starting on products of China in February of 25, or, the rest of the world in April, including the EU. So for luxury items, there were some companies that made public statements and said, we're raising our prices because of the tariffs. So I think they're very exposed. Other companies didn't make such statements and may have raised prices across the board, either at the tariff rate that they were charged. Let's say they're from the EU, so a total of 15%, or China, whatever the rate, was sliding from very high to still high. Or some companies raised some product categories, but didn't raise others. But even if there are defenses, it doesn't stop the plaintiff's bar from being very aggressive. And we fully expect that. So companies should be doing things now to mitigate that risk.
Like what?
There are ways, and I'm not a class action attorney, trade attorney, but I've now been on a number of calls with class action attorneys, counseling clients, and there are ways they call it diffuse the class, things that companies can do proactively.
That I'm familiar with just some of the work that we've done over time. And do you think that there's anything from just kind of thinking outside the box, right? So if you think about first of all, there could be a lot of negative backlash against certain retailers, which would not be good. Is there any way for them to kind of, okay, we're going to get this refund. Let's say it's $10. We put it in this account, and then, we're not taking that kind of, well, of course, we're getting the refund, so we'll have to handle it from financial purposes. But if we allocate that to our consumers during that time period, how do you advise the retailers to kind of think about this, not only from a comms perspective, but also in terms of how they're thinking about it structurally?
Well, they can try to we don't know how long it's going to take for the refunds to come, right? It could take 2-3, it could be automatic. It could take 2-3 years, which is, I think, sort of maybe a reasonable expectation, or the president said it could take 5 years. So we don't know how long it's going to take. So in that interim, while they're waiting for the refunds, companies to diffuse the class could give some smaller rebate at point of sale for example.
Mm. That's an interesting idea. And so now we have the whole thing with like IEPA. We are now in this kind of refund rebate moment. But now there's a whole new, right? I feel like I just keep on opening all these doors, right? Like, and each door gets either smaller or bigger. I'm not sure which way it's going, but depends on the day. So now we've just opened this new door on tariffs. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So right away, Friday afternoon, the administration announced an additional 10% on all products coming into the U.S. pursuant to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. So some good news. First of all, the statute of limitations on the Trade Act of 74 is only 5 years. The statute of limitations under IEPA was 10 years. So that's some good news. 10%. If you're from the UK, it's a wash, 10%, 10%. Companies in the EU, sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, depending on what the general duty was. Certainly from China, 10% is better than not, or Vietnam, So it really depends on what country you're sourcing from. So the president has 150 days from February 24th. It went into effect on February 24th. So technically right now, the 10% across the board is going to expire July 24th. Whether it survives to July 24th or not is an open question because there will be motions for an injunction against Section 1, the use of Section 122. So we don't know if it's going to survive till July. And I want to say one other thing about Section 122, the use of it, and the executive order that came out on Friday is that there are 2 annexes of exceptions. So there's a whole swath of products that are coming in duty-free. Well, there's general duty, but exempt from the 10% tariff, including, by the way, textile and apparel products that are compliant with DR-CAFTA, which did not exist under IEPA, well, except for the recent trade agreements. But
that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And, de minimis impacted, I think, more folks than we would have expected, right? Lululemon talked about it on one of their earnings calls, right? Lululemon is a Canadian-based company with warehouses in Canada. So going back to, and I think even the companies, when they were providing original financial updates based on the tariffs, I remember on third quarter earnings calls, like some of the numbers they were throwing out were just kind of like mind numbing and boggling, I guess, all at the same time. Where do you think we go with de minimis?
So as of this week, and the 10% across the board is in place, when I've been talking to companies this week is, we no longer have de minimis. Let's enter all the merchandise, as much merchandise as we can at 10%, because we don't know. It could go up to 15 at any time, as the administration has been threatening, or 122 could be disallowed, and they could have an investigation pursuant to Section 301, which seems to be impervious to litigation, and the rate could be much higher. So 10% is a manageable rate. So I think the companies that have a de minimis setup still with a warehouse in Canada or Mexico are now trying to enter as much as they can while this 10% window is open.
So that's interesting. And then there's a lot we can talk about with ESG, sustainability, whatever kind of umbrella we want to use. But we're seeing a lot happening at the state level. Can you kind of walk us through how this idea of like the green trade movement, what that looks like, where we are, and what you're seeing people do and have success with?
So for the European companies I work with, this green movement, sustainability is very important to the companies. There are a number of proposed state legislation in the U.S. There's some proposed the CBAM equivalent for the U.S., but it hasn't really gone anywhere. There hasn't been a lot of traction. Like the fashion bill in New York has been, sort of languishing in the state assembly for a while. I don't see that it has a lot of legs at this time. And companies, unfortunately, have to have other priorities. They may have wanted to focus on sustainability and green issues, but tariffs, the numbers are so overwhelming for companies. I mean, certainly for small companies, but even large companies are really struggling with the, like you said, you saw the number, you heard the numbers on the earnings calls. The numbers are staggering.
I mean, it was hundreds of basis points of negative impact to margin. And then, the challenge is, I don't think many people, I mean, at least not the chief supply chain officers we talked to, had necessarily expected the ruling. And so they've also started to lean more into, right, like higher price goods, if you will. So I think the challenge is, as they're thinking about their assortments, it's like the ground keeps moving underneath them.
Very much so. The ground is moving.
So how do they, without having somebody located in Washington, how do they stay on top of all this, and how do they position themselves?
So if we go back to the first Trump administration, when the tariffs were just put on products of China, right? It's about 2/3 of the products coming from China under Section 301 have additional either 25% or 7.5%. That was put in effect in the first Trump administration, kept in effect during the Biden administration, and still in effect. So I would say from July of 2018, the sourcing strategy was anywhere but China, right? And we spoke a lot about nearshoring, moving to other Asian countries. That was the sourcing. So that's how you kept the ground sort of stable and protect yourself. Then in the second Trump administration, where there were tariffs on every country, could companies move from one country of origin, from one country to another country to reduce whatever the percentage was, right? If you move from the EU to the UK, there was a differential, or you move from China to Vietnam, there was a differential. And even that makes an impact if it was a 5% difference, right? But now we don't have that. IEEPA is gone. So what should companies do now? And I think that's your question. So there are certain constants in trade law that are still here, like the rules of valuation, for example. So if your unit price, whether your unit price is $1,000 a unit or $10 a unit, there are legal ways to reduce the value of the goods upon which duty is based. There are certain legal deductions that can be taken. International freight is always deductible. Foreign inland freight is deductible if it's set up correctly. Foreign port charges. Then there are other strategies to reduce the value of the goods.
So just with all this, with things being so dynamic, and even staying on top of something like AGOA and whatnot, how are they, right, without having somebody based in Washington, how are they able to follow this? How are they able to kind of align their sourcing strategies? Or should they just outsource it? What's the right thing for them to do? And how are you helping to kind of guide your clients?
Well, I do not recommend outsourcing it if the company is the importer of record, because all the liability is with the importer of record. And by the way, the only parties to date that are available to get the refunds from IEEPA are the importer of record. So if a company, on the line thinks that they're entitled, if IEEPA costs have been passed on to them, but they're not the importer of record into the U.S., they should look at their commercial agreements with the importer and see if there's a possibility, or get that agreement in place prior to refunds being issued. So as I mentioned, enforcement is up, so compliance has to be up, and companies have to look at the classification, the valuation, and the origin. So trying to really reduce the value, the constants in value, looking at royalty payments, for example. Sometimes royalty payments have to be included in the value declared to customs, but other times if the supply chain transaction is structured correctly, royalty payments can be deducted. We've been drafting exclusivity agreements with foreign suppliers to try to reduce the value of the imported goods, to make that $1,000 a unit, make it something $750 or $10 to $8. But so there are lots of sourcing strategies that can be done in terms of duty mitigation.
And then on a completely different topic, but during the pandemic, having myself spend a lot of time working in supply chain, we had helped different senators and congresspeople think through, right, if we have another event like this, how do you protect and make sure we have enough PPE, manufactured domestically? Where is everyone kind of thinking about domestic manufacturing, especially around PPE? Like what if anything has actually like really changed?
So I think the Trump administration has been very clear that they like their tariff regime. They like the idea of tariffs with a goal of increasing domestic manufacturing. And we haven't really seen a tremendous shift that way yet, but they're working to, they've announced that they're working the new investigations that they've been doing, the ones that they've done already, the Section 232, 301 was just on China, but they're going to be rolling out additional investigations with an eye toward increasing domestic manufacturing, particularly of the products that they consider crucial for the United States, which would include, the pharmaceuticals, PPE, things that we discussed during the pandemic. So I think we're going to see, because IEEPA is no longer, the 10% under 122 is temporary. I think the focus of the administration is going to be on these targeted investigations, which so far have been impervious to litigation. So we're going to see targeted countries and targeted products within those countries.
Why do you think that?
Well, they've announced that they're going to be looking into certain products and certain countries. I think they realize, particularly after the Supreme Court case, that this just blanket across the board it's not going to survive. And it's a stopgap measure for them. The only way, like the 301 on China, which still stands, there's a class action lawsuit against the administration still going on. The cert was just filed to the Supreme Court. That's been going on since like 2019, but it's not going to be successful. The way they rolled out 301 for products of China, there was an investigation, Federal Register notice and comment. It was done pursuant to law. So I think IEEPA may have been rolled out it was rolled out without an investigation because the statute doesn't require an investigation. But the use of Section 232 or 301 requires an investigation by the Department of Commerce. And then they do their investigation, how quick or slow that investigation is. But then they publish it in the Federal Register. There's opportunity for the public to comment, and then they add on the additional tariffs. So it's a much safer route, and it's more targeted. Like the 232 that we have in place now, we have, steel, aluminum, copper, but it's the derivative products. That's sort of the dangerous list. The stainless steel sinks and counters and doors and windows, and then the kitchen cabinets, upholstered furniture, and autos and auto parts. It's a very long list, and the list is going to get a lot longer as they roll out their investigations.
What do you think that ultimately looks like?
I think they're going to be issuing Section 232 tariffs on a lot of different product groupings this year.
So it's interesting. I hadn't planned it, but I was talking to a dear friend of mine yesterday, and he said a lot of what you did, which was this idea around enforcement, because he said they're seeing dollars, I think, much greater than they had expected. So as a former Wall Street analyst, I'm always like, kind of show me the money and follow the money. What is that telling us?
Yeah. There's going to be enforcement. And by the way, the Department of Justice in the spring of 25, the criminal division issued a memorandum, which was released to the public, talking about their priorities for the year in terms of enforcement. Trade fraud and tariff evasion was number 2. So the importing community is on notice that it's not just U.S. Customs, but there's a joint task force between Customs and the Department of Justice. And there are lots of statutes, as I talk with my colleagues who are, white-collar defense attorneys. There are lots of statutes that the Justice Department can use, whether it's at the corporate level or the C-suite. So it's a dangerous time. As I said, it's heavy enforcement. So you really have to look at compliance while balancing, try to being aggressive but compliant in your declarations to customs and reducing the value as much as you can. companies should be aggressive because the tariffs are just too burdensome.
I mean, ultimately, okay, we're going to get this refund. It'll end up in consumers' pockets, let's say sometime in the next 5 years, maybe. But you can't, I mean, the math doesn't work, right? You can't raise prices on inputs and expect to not have inflation. Where does that leave us?
Well, I can't speak to the inflation, but I think companies slowly have raised their prices, whether it's across the board, raising the prices, or strategically. I spoke to one company this week that had raised certain product categories, and they said, well, just because the tariffs are gone or, have much reduced for us, and that company is all in China, so it's a major reduction down to 10. They said, we're not going to lower our prices. Those are baked in now, and I think that specialists in consumer attitudes and buying trends know, there's a way to roll that out. I don't think companies are going to be rolling that back anytime soon.
Let's go back to the higher prices, because I think what's interesting in some cases, right, we've seen some of the retailers who I think are putting more make into their good now. And so what we're seeing in some ways is the stronger. And I find that to be very interesting. And so if you're improving the quality of your product, what do you tell companies to document? How do they think through kind of not only for their own internal kind of processes, but for any documentation they need externally?
Yeah. So because companies, as you said, the strong get stronger. So because those companies are being, as I say, aggressive on their pricing and what's declared to U.S. Customs, which is my focus, those agreements are more important than ever. Agreements with the manufacturer, agreements with customers, memorializing how you arrived at certain questions. I mean, or, what is the country of origin, or that royalty agreement that buying agents agreements, if that's set up correctly, is also a legal deduction from the value declared. So we're looking at a lot of agreements and making sure they really protect the importer.
And this is a personal question. I spent a lot of my time in this area just by chance, but how did you end up in this area of law? Because outside of kind of from being in Washington and whatnot, and especially during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time in this area. But it's such a unique area. It's fascinating and complex. But what drew you to it?
So here's my personal story. So my father had an international practice. So that's the household that I grew up in. We grew up wherever his project was of the moment. He worked a lot in the energy industry with underdeveloped countries, was where we traveled to. So I knew I wanted to be a lawyer like him, and I wanted an international practice, and I wanted to live in New York. I grew up in Washington. I wanted to live in New York. So U.S. Customs Chief Counsel's Office, which is based at headquarters. When I was working there, was under the Department of Treasury. Now it's under Homeland Security. And they still have an office in New York, which is part of Chief Counsel, that does the litigation in the Court of International Trade. So I thought, I'm fresh out of law school. This is a court that has exclusive jurisdiction for the United States on international trade. That sounds interesting. And I didn't know anything. But what was interesting about that office, and it was really happenstance, that's how I ended up there. But what was interesting about that office is the Court of International Trade filing, other than these once-a-generation cases like IEPA, the cases that get there have gone through an administrative process. So production is years past. Ordering POs, that's years before. And then there's a whole administrative process. And then if the importer is not happy, most of the time, the plaintiff in the Court of International Trade is the importer. And then they sue the Customs as the defendant. And so I was working at Customs, representing the Customs in the court. So, you'd get in those days it was on paper, you'd get a big file, and production was years before. And So I was there for a number of years. And then I went to private practice, which I actually think is more interesting because you're helping companies with their sourcing strategies and their agreements pre-production. Where should we source? How should we price our goods? How can we do this legally and being aggressive and knowing that at the end of the line, if something goes south, you could end up in the court.
So you were involved in this during quota, right? And so that was kind of my background when I was at Li & Fung, right? Li & Fung had bought up a bunch of quota, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was right as that organization evolved. I think they had their challenges. But can you take us through, right, kind of most retailers that are with us today, right? They've been through that. What did they learn from that? And how did they make business decisions? And then what do you think they're learning from today's environment?
Well, one thing I find very interesting, quota was a very tough time for companies. I think it was very tough to, companies like Li & Fung could buy up quota, but for a lot of companies, it was a very difficult time. And then quota went away in this industry. I mean, it's still in other industries, but not in this industry. And then in the agreement that the Trump administration made with Indonesia just Thursday of last week, it seems like another century ago, but Thursday of last week, there's quota for apparel products in that Indonesian agreement. Now, it's not ratified, it's not signed, but that was the agreement so I find it very interesting that it's the first time I've seen that the administration has gone back to a quote for textile and apparels, has gone back to quota. So we'll see as they work out what happens with their trade deals, which now all need to be looked at, and other trade deals. Are they going to go the route of quota? For, other than, sugar from Brazil still has quota, but
yeah.
But for textiles, are they going to go the way of quota? I think knowing the difficulties of the past, I think it would be another hurdle for companies that are importing. But maybe there's opportunity where you can, I don't want to say like game the system, but figure out when the quota's going to close and how much you can get in and be really strategic. And again, as you said, the stronger will get stronger. I think it'll be very difficult, but it'll be interesting if they go that route.
And one more question before we get to the lightning round, which is always the funnest part here. We're starting to hear about more AI and enforcement versus compliance. And I think the U.S. Customs is now using AI to map different footprints before a shipment leaves a port. How does a client's internal due diligence match the sophistication of what the government is focusing on?
Well, the government has a bigger budget than most companies.
That is true.
So even when there are reauthorization issues. So I think companies really need to focus on what is their risk and then spend accordingly. So we know some of the tools that U.S. Customs is using. They've announced it publicly. We don't know all the tools. We know some of them. I was on a demonstration with a company that does satellite imagery of particularly looking for forced labor, farms but the background of they have contracts with U.S. Customs and other government entities. Like this company just didn't start with forced labor. They've been doing other satellite imagery for many other issues in the past. But I don't know many companies that could afford this company, but we know that U.S. Customs is using it, for example. But there are lots of AI tools that companies can use, but I really think companies should spend according to their risk in their supply chain. So if you're an importer of electronics, you have the most risk. I actually checked the statistics before we spoke today, the forced labor statistics. And to date, 39 billion worth of goods have been detained since the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act went into effect in June of 22. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's 3.9 billion. 3.9 billion worth of goods have been detained, of which 3.2 billion is electronics.
Wow.
Right? 496 million is base metals and 96 million is apparel, footwear, and textiles. Only 96 million of the 3.9 billion. So certainly if you're in cotton apparel, you have higher risk than other apparel, but I think we should, keep it in perspective. And the number of shipments to date that have been detained is a little over 69,000. So if you think of the enormity of this, and that's total number of shipments. And that's clearly much of that is electronics.
It's crazy. All right, we're going to move over to the lightning round.
Okay.
We have 10 questions in 5 minutes. I know you can do it. And if you want to pass, I know you just say pass.
Okay.
Number 1, favorite trade term.
Well, it's just going to speak to how straight I am. I'm going to say FOB.
Oh my God, that's like, that was mine. Because I was like, the minute I understood what that was, I knew I had like crossed over into, I don't know what. But I was like, that was, because like when you're studying it in school, you're like, this makes like absolutely no sense. But then when you actually really do understand, that's so funny. I knew that we had that shared passion.
Yeah.
Let's give it. All right, number 2, the hardest part of your job.
I would say starting in 2025, seeing particularly the smaller companies. I work with a range of, very large, multinational down to, we also work with some smaller companies or even middle-sized companies that are just, even hundreds of millions, just struggling with the increased tariffs. They've really been onerous. Yeah. I would say in 2025, that was definitely the hardest.
Number 3, most underrated skill for a trade lawyer.
Well, I'd like to think that we're not going to be replaced by AI and that there is some value to experience and judgment.
I think that's, we've seen that absolutely the case. And I was on a call with somebody yesterday and they're like, the future is for the learners, right? Like, and I was like, oh, that's exactly who I am. And I think you are too. It's like those who love to learn, right? Because you're going to always probably be ahead, at least for maybe until we're at like super intelligence, right? Which is above AGI, right? Like the more relevant, the more questions you ask, the more curious, which is exactly who you are. I think that we're always going to be relevant. All right. Number 4, best city for a trade conference.
Okay. So don't be envious, but I go to Venice once a year for a luxury ESG conference. You can come with me next year. It's in the fall in Venice. It's lovely.
I think I'm going to put that one on my calendar. That sounds great.
But this year I'm at post SCOTUS ruling Customs annual conference, which is always fun. This year it's in Dallas. Anyone on the line should sign up and come join me for dinner. It's at the end of April. It's in Dallas. That is going to be a really fun conference this year for us trade nerds.
That sounds great too. All right. One tool that you can't live without. It's like solution, how you do your job. Could be coffee.
Okay. This is going to sound, like my friend said, really trade nerdy, but I cannot tell you how often I am on the White House website looking at proclamations of the president and executive orders and rereading them and staying on top of them.
I can't even imagine how you stay on top of everything, especially over the last 5 years, 5-6 years. It's like every day you wake up and there's more to learn. If you weren't a trade lawyer, what would you be?
Oh, definitely a professional tennis player.
I love that.
But it's a good thing I have my day job because I don't think I'd make much money if I were on the pro circuit.
I've met more people who play pickleball and like the last 2 days, I'm like, I've never tried it, but I definitely must.
I'm a tennis purist.
I love it. And we have a lot of young listeners, right? Those who are in college and trying to figure out kind of next steps in their career. What advice would you give to them?
Someone said this to me, and I think it was really good advice, was having a specialty. So I sort of told you my route to getting into the trade world, but within the trade world, like there are like a lot of lawyers, but it's really being a specialist in working with importing companies. That's the way, and I think particularly for a woman, and I think I still would say that, you can still have value and have a great career.
Absolutely. I think that, I'll tell you, I think my son was like, if I'd only listened to him, I would have had the greatest stock call of my life. He's like a year and a half, right? He's been on like a bunch of store tours with me. And we're at a Kohl's. And he's like, why do they sell picture frames here? And I was like, I couldn't right, because it was a little bit, right, they do a great job in like soft home and whatnot, but starting to go into hard home and it was just, and then like literally, I kid you not, like 4 weeks after that, the stock completely collapsed. So sometimes I think when we bring our children along with us in our work, right, we should listen to some of their insights. So Laura, thank you so much. I've never had an hour move so quickly. And this topic, I think we've just scratched the surface. I look forward to having you on again soon, especially after I spend some time in Washington next week. But thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again.
I would love that. Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us this week. Coresight Research serves our members with leadership communities, strategy, consulting, technology assessment, data resources, seminars, conferences, proprietary research, and more. Visit us at Coresight.com to learn about all the ways we can support your success. Have a wonderful week.